Hi, I'm Pete, and welcome to Just a Few Acres Farm. It's just another day on the farm, chasing bolt holes. 24 head bolts on this engine, and the holes for each head bolt need to be chased. A little bit of gunk on there, not much. Look down each one of them. In this video, I'm going to be doing probably the most nerve-wracking thing about reassembling an engine. That is the head gasket and the head. And then moving right on, the thing that really powers the engine: compression, stroke, valves, opening and closing, compression and ignition. This is the heart of how an engine works. We're putting it together today. I have learned via the School of Hard Knocks that you can't skip steps when you're getting ready to put on a head and head gasket. You got to check all the boxes for your own peace of mind as well as the future performance of the engine. And what I'm doing here is chasing the threads with a tap of these head bolt holes to make sure there's no rough spots in the threads. After all, how old is this block? 1955 to 2024, almost 75 years old. It's had rusty water in the water jacket. It's had all kinds of gunk and grime in it. You want to make sure that these are all evenly clean so that you can get an even torque when you torque down the head bolts. That is so important. This block's relatively clean, but you still run into some gunk. And I look down into each hole to make sure if it's a blind hole, it's not filled up with stuff in the bottom. And this way I learn also which holes go directly into the water jacket and need to be sealed later on. Here's what we have. This is the water jacket side of the engine. See where the soft plugs were? I got to replace those. All the holes on this side go directly into the water jacket. There's no bottom in them. All of the holes in the middle are blind, which means they have a bottom on them. They just seat in. You got to make sure those are cleaned out, that there's not a ton of gunk in there that's going to stop the bolt or crack the casting. And then on the other side of the engine we have the tappet gallery, which the push rods go down through. All of these holes go directly into that gallery. See? There's light at the bottom of the hole. Next step, the finish on the top of the block right here. This is called the deck of the block. First thing, it needs to be flat, of course. And the machinist checked it for flat with a machinist straight edge. I said you can deck the block if you want. Decking the block is just taking a thin layer off of it to true it up if it's warped. It wasn't, so he didn't deck the block. The next thing to look for is the type of finish that you have on the deck. And this is a phonograph finish. See these kind of, they look like record grooves almost in here. This is a great finish to have because it helps grab onto the head gasket when the head gasket is torqued down and compressed against this. The next thing is surface irregularities. You can see I have a little carbon or something here that needs to be taken off. But most of the irregularities don't need to be dealt with. You'll find things like this. This is a little pitting around this water jacket hole. That's fine. You can see where the head gasket seats around there. It's not going to affect the head gasket. And you'll have staining once in a while like this, which is just long-term exposure to carbon or oil. It doesn't affect the finish on the block, so it's fine to leave as is. See if I can get this little rough spot off. Usually, and always actually, in my experience, this surface doesn't warp because it's backed by all of this cast iron below it. It keeps it true. Heads, yeah, they warp, and almost always when I have a head done it winds up getting planed to true it. I've never had a block deck that was out of true far enough to have it milled, planed, decked, whatever you want to call it. I'm using a green Scotch-Brite and lacquer thinner and just lightly, because you really should use a less coarse Scotch-Brite, to lightly clean this. I want to get every single bit of oil and gunk off of this. I want it to be as clean as I can get it. Then wipe it down soaked in lacquer thinner here till the rag comes up clean. This is the cylinder head for the engine. The machinist David Richards worked his magic on it. Do you remember how cruddy it was? Rusty, mouse turds, squirrel turds, all up in the intake passages. He shot blasted this all out, and it's nice and clean now. I hope you can see in there. I had him plane this edge here, this face, because these heads were known for blowing out exhaust manifold gaskets and then leaking exhaust gases into the intake and running hot. The valve springs are what they were. They weren't replaced. They're not new. But Dave goes through with a spring gauge and measures each one, and then he'll shim them so that they have the same sort of action, I guess you would call it. On the bottom side here, the exhaust valves were fine. They had lots of meat on the mating surfaces. He ground these, ground the seats. There are hardened seats in this head already. They were fine with some cleanup. And I found a set of new old stock intake valves, and he put those in. The valve guides were fine, nice and tight still, not a lot of wiggle in them. Again, he puts a phonograph finish on this mating surface. It's a bit smoother than the block deck, but you can see the spiral kind of grooves in here. And I just want to take any oil, he sprayed this with WD-40 just to keep it from rusting, off of this before we put it together. Head gasket, new old stock. Who knows how many decades this has been waiting to be installed. It has two different faces, and one of the questions is always which side goes up. Well, the easy way is to lay it. All the holes line up as you go through every little coolant hole and every little head bolt hole. They all line up. If I flip it over, these holes on the ends don't line up. That's an easy way to check. Sometimes they're marked top. Often they're not. The head's ready to go on. I found in engine rebuilding, there's things that you really need to focus on a whole lot, and you should put your microscope to and make sure you do all the steps. And there's other things that you don't need to focus on so much. Mechanics to me has always been not a black and white thing. It's always been full of grays as far as how different folks do things. And putting on head gaskets is a good example of that. If you read around, there's all kinds of different schools of thought and people that were taught to do it this way and do it that way. For instance, I started out using Permatex High-Tack, the same stuff I use on regular gaskets, on both sides of this before I put it on, and it worked pretty good. And then some time or another, somebody told me that, well, that's old school, and here's this copper spray-a-gasket stuff, or whatever it's called, the copper that everybody sprays on head gaskets now, lets it tack up and puts it on for a metal-clad head gasket. So I started using that stuff, and it worked okay. And then came along the MD project, the M diesel tractor. And I used a fiber gasket for the first time. I put copper spray on it and it failed, and I learned something really important. And there are other folks that swear by things like Indian head gasket shellac, which is an old school gasket sealer. There are other folks from an even older school that say to put grease on both sides, and they'll all tell you usually that their way is the best, and you have to kind of incorporate all this in your brain and think about how this is all working. And here's what I think. If you have the proper finish on the block deck, this phonograph finish with a little bit of grab to it, not mirror smooth, and you have the same finish on the head, then when you set that gasket and torque it, everything's going to grab together. Assuming you have a nice flat block deck and a flat head where everything presses down at the same rate, and you torque your bolts properly. And the danger in sealers is what I learned with the MD. You never use them on a fiber gasket because they can create a cleavage membrane. It's an old architectural term from actually porcelain tile flooring, but you create a membrane where the two surfaces can slide relative to each other. So if you think about the ring, the metal ring that's right around the cylinder where combustion is happening and pressure is building up very quickly as that explosion is happening, if you have room for parts of that head gasket to slide back and forth, that's probably not a good thing. You're not going to get a tight seal over time. And in addition, this isn't heating up such that it's going to fry or bake whatever sealant you use, because it's got a water jacket all around it. So it's not say in my example of using high-tack in the old days, I used to think, well, it gets fried because it's so hot and it turns into some kind of char. It doesn't. It actually stays a little bit flexible, so you get that movement. And I saw an extreme case of that in the MD head gasket, where the fiber part of the gasket actually tore away from the metal ring that's right around the cylinder because the sealant allowed it to do that. Now, if sealant is used, it's important to keep it really super thin so that you don't have a big hunk of kind of elastomeric material that can move back and forth. That's my opinion, and it's only my opinion. The golden rule is always to do what works for you and to do what experience has taught you works. And when it comes to getting instructions from the manufacturer on how to install your head gasket, they've never come with head gaskets I've ordered. When I had problems with the MD, my supplier had to go back to the manufacturer. They never come with any pieces of paper in the kits. Alignment dowels. Here we go. Not easy, it's pretty heavy. My shirt got stuck in it. Come out of there. Head bolts. These side is all along the water jacket, so I put a little of this stuff on it. High temperature thread sealant, Permatex. Pull out these alignment dowels. Push rods. This is a piece of float glass that I'm putting it on, and if you roll it around, you can see whether it's bent or not. You check them all for straight. You'll see it wobble if it's bent. And then I usually sight down them as well to make sure they're straight. Lifters, valve tappets. I keep these organized by bore because I figure they've both worn into their bore and into a relationship with the lobe on the camshaft that they contact. You know, nothing's quite flat on these or on the camshaft lobe to keep it rotating around so it wears evenly. A little shot in the top. In you go, little buddy. Push rods. These are not location specific because we're going to adjust tappet gap when we get everything together. In this view, let's just see exactly how they work. The camshaft down here rotates and it's got lobes on it that are eccentric, and it pushes up and down on the tappets, and then the tappets push the push rods. The push rods push the rocker arms, or rock the rocker arms, and push up and down on the valves. Super simple. And the reason I had to put all that on is because the other head bolts go through the rocker arm assembly. Well, you guys are all messed up. I thought I kept you in order. First bolt to go in is this hollow one that feeds the oil to the rocker arm assembly. I just want to make sure I don't lose track of that, so we'll get that in first. I always lube bolts to be torqued. It's right in the service guide from International Harvester that you very lightly lube bolts to be torqued. And the important thing about lubing head bolts, I think head bolts are like the most important bolts to lubricate is you want them all to torque evenly. That's the big thing with head gas, especially on an old engine like this. 5 or 10 or even sometimes 20 foot-pounds of torque. You're not even close to the yield point of the bolts. And you want them to be even as much as the exact torque. You know, it's important to get an equal crush on that head gasket and to get it to seat into those little record grooves that are finished into it. I'm putting a little thread sealant on the bolts on this side too, which go down into that oil gallery for the tappets and push rods, just to seal it up. Probably not necessary, but also can't hurt. Let's see, 3 go through the valve cover. How does that line up? Front. These 3. 1, 2, 3. Right? Yep. I almost forgot these. These are little caps that go on the intake valve stems. I'm not sure why. They're not rotators. They're just caps. Finally, before I start torquing everything down, this is the coolant outlet that goes to the radiator. Temperature sensor goes in here. Thermostat goes in here. There you go. Next, we can tighten everything down. In the service manual, they've actually got a head bolt tightening sequence in here, which I don't normally have the pleasure of using, but of course you start in the middle. 1, 2, 3. You can see the pattern. 4. You're always starting in the middle from both sides and working out both this way and this way. So I'll follow the order. In the book, in one spot, it says to tighten the head bolts to 80 foot-pounds, and another section, it says to go to 100. So I guess I'll split the difference and go to 90. I can always tighten them more later on if I need to. I'm tightening them in 2 steps. First step is to 50, and then I'll go to 90. And now to 100. Yes, I changed my mind. It's 100. Ding, dong. I don't have a crow's foot to put on this. I'm going to have to get a set. And finally, I'll go over them once more. You know, if you do it from the other side of the engine like I'm doing, you get a more complete torque. It's true. If you work the bolt from both sides. Usually the ones you started on will take a little more because everything's crushing down. Now we'll take a break so I can read you some geeky factoids. First of all, what is the pressure on this head gasket? How many PSI is being exerted on it just from torquing the head down? Well, to figure that out, you find out the area that's being clamped. So that's basically the size of the head minus the area of each cylinder that's in it, because they're not being clamped down on, it's void. And then you run it through a clamping force table, which has a whole lot of variables: the type of bolt, the size of bolt, the condition of the threads, how it's lubed to torque, etc., etc. Anyway, after going through all of that, the force is about 200 psi, pounds per square inch, exerted on this head gasket. And of course there's more exerted on it probably when the engine's running. I didn't go through that calculation. The second geeky thing is how many cubic inches of displacement have I converted this engine to. It was originally 282 cubic inches. Well, I ran the math because we increased the bore size by a 1/16 inch on each cylinder, and that brings it all the way up to a whopping 292 cubic inches, which is a 3.5% increase. The next step on this engine is to set the valves. In other words, you have to calibrate when the valves are being opened, because the adjustments on this end are all messed up. And to do that, I need to identify which are the intake and which are the exhaust valves for each cylinder. If we go over here and look at the manifold, this is the intake portion of the manifold. The carburetor sits here, so everything on the intake side is connected to that. And we have 3 intake ports, and then we've got all of these exhaust ports. I can mark those ports on the engine, so where I put a line or an I, that's an intake port, that's an intake port, and that's an intake port. Normally on these old engines, and this one's no exception, the intake ports are shared. So if you look in this intake port, there is a valve stem sticking through there. That's one intake valve. And then on the other side, there's another valve stem sticking through there. So this one intake serves 2 valves, these 2 valves right here. When it comes to exhaust valves, you can see one exhaust valve in there. There are 6 ports for the exhaust, so there's 1 port per exhaust valve. Another clue is if you look up top, the intake and exhaust valves are different. The intake valves have a flat cap on the spring here, while the exhaust valves have this one that tapers inward, and then remember I put caps on them. For the next part, you got to know the 4 strokes of an engine cycle. The first stroke, stroke 1, is intake valve open, cylinder is sucking in air. That's the intake stroke, piston is moving down. Second stroke is the compression stroke. Intake valve closes, both valves are closed, piston's coming back up and compressing the air charge that has been taken in the last stroke, compressing it. Next stroke, power stroke, when the piston reaches around the top, depending on timing and advance and all that, but around the top of that compression, the spark plug fires, the gas-air mixture ignites, and you get the power stroke, pushing the piston back down. Both valves remain closed during this stroke because you want to trap that reaction within the cylinder. Fourth stroke is the exhaust stroke. When the piston gets to the bottom of its stroke, the exhaust valve opens, the piston starts to come back up and pushes that burnt mixture out of the engine and out the exhaust port. It's important to walk before you can run, and in order to walk, you need to know that basic thing. Now with all that, we can start setting the valves. So I know which is my intake valve on the number 1 piston. Number 1's always to the front. The intake valve is this one. This is the exhaust valve. So I hook a wrench onto the crankshaft bolt here, and we can turn the engine. Engines always turn clockwise. I'll show you those 4 strokes on the engine. This is the intake valve. This is the exhaust valve. Stroke 1, intake valve opens. Piston is going down, sucking in gas-air mixture. Piston's at the bottom of its stroke, intake valve closes. Now we're on the compression stroke. Both valves are closed. It's coming back up the piston and it's squeezing that air mixture. And that's going to be up and down because you've got the compression stroke and the power stroke. Both valves are closed. That's stroke 3 of the 4 strokes. And then when the piston reaches the bottom again, this exhaust valve is opening and the piston's coming back up on its stroke to push that burnt mixture out the exhaust. Those 4 strokes take 2 revolutions of the crankshaft to complete, and that's why the camshaft gear here is so much bigger than the crankshaft gear, because every time the camshaft rotates once and you go through those 4 cycles, remember the exhaust valve and the intake valve only actuate once each during the 4 cycles, this is rotating twice. So for every 2 revolutions of the crankshaft, there's only 1 revolution of the camshaft. Next, you need to know the firing order of your engine, and it's written right on the side here, 1, 5, 3, 6, 2, 4. Those are cylinder numbers, and that way you can set the valves, because you have to set the valves at top dead center compression which is when the piston is at the top of its travel on that compression stroke that I talked about, between compression and power or detonation of that spark plug. There are faster ways to set valve lash, but I'm going to do it the slow way because I'm kind of going through this in detail with you all. So first you want to find top dead center of compression. And I know I'm on the compression stroke now because both valves are closed. The intake valve just finished closing. This engine does not have the pulley installed yet that's got the timing pointer on it, so I'm going to use a little cheat here. This is an old screwdriver that the handle came off of, and I can use that to see the advance of the piston. So it's coming up right now, and when that stops moving like it has, I know I'm at the top. See, it's starting to move back down now. When it's at the top there, I know that I'm at top dead center. Top of compression stroke, both of these valves are closed, and this is called the valve lash, this little wiggle here. On this engine, it's spec'd to be 23 thousandths for both intake and exhaust valves. Some engines have different measurements for intake and exhaust, but this one doesn't. And these need to be adjusted just a touch. To adjust them, you put a wrench on this nut, a screwdriver in this, loosen the nut, and then you can turn the screwdriver to adjust the lash. That's good. And tighten it back up. Do the same with the intake valve. Well, that one's pretty good. Next piston in the firing order is number 5. So on number 5, this is the intake valve and this is the exhaust valve. We'll check where we are. It should be a third of a turn to get to where we need to be. Oh, they're really out of whack. You can't even tell what's going on. Sometimes you got to look at the push rods and see what they're doing instead of the rocker arms. Piston's coming up. Push rods aren't moving, so we know we're on the compression stroke. Look at our screwdriver meter here. The manufacturer of the engine will spec the temperature that you need to do this at because everything expands as the engine gets hotter. International Harvester's rule has always been to do it what they call hot. They'll give gap hot or tap at gap hot. Hot is classified as room temperature in their case, so 23 thousandths. 3. 6. 2. 4. It's not building compression with no spark plugs in the holes, so I can spin it over pretty fast. You can see how all the valves work. Let's try this. Wine cork tolerances just aren't what they used to be. That's compression. That was pretty darn cool. These little extensions are what the valve cover bolts to. I just put this valve cover on temporarily to protect everything. After the engine's all together and we do first startup and everything warms up, I'll take this back off, retorque the head bolts because everything loosens up as you get pressures working in the head, and you got to retorque them all, and then I'll have to, of course, reset the valve tappet gap. But for now, we're pretty much done on this end. That's it for this installment of the engine rebuild. What are the next steps? Well, I guess the oil pump, I got to take a look at that. We'll check it out. Put the oil pan on, front timing cover, the valve tappet cover, lots of miscellaneous little stuff. The expansion plugs and the block soft plugs. we'll just keep plugging along. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.